Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erica West, a principal at the Rabin Group. My job today was just to welcome you and to kick off our conversation. But unfortunately, our planned moderator, Corinne Jean-Pierre, was called to some urgent work and could not join us. So I'll do my best to moderate in her place. So welcome to our conversation, our virtual conversation, Resilience and Solidarity, When the Fight is Personal. Tools for women and people of color to self-sustain through the work and through movements. I'll just say a little word about Rabin for a moment. We're a public policy and public affairs firm with offices nationwide. Although now, we're all remote, as everyone is, who is able to be. The focus of our client work and our partners at Rabin is social justice, and across issues and communities, we help them plan for how to shift power and resources to people who typically don't have it. And often women of color and people of color are leading in this work, always have. And while this work is often necessary as a matter of basic survival, it's also a calling, with a sense that we're working for ourselves and our families and friends and communities. And it's very personal to have to fight for your own space in the world, and to do the work that is also your life. It can be a lot. So especially at this time when we're dealing with a global pandemic, we're dealing with the ways that that pandemic is affecting our communities in different ways. And it's impacting all of the movement work that we were already doing. This is a moment to have this conversation about resilience and sustaining ourselves. So we're talking today with three brilliant leaders: Brittany Packnett-Cunningham, Gracia Martinez-Rosas, and Deepa Iyer. All of these women know a lot about how to fight for justice, and they also know about how to sustain through it all, because for our good fortune, they are continuing to do the work. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. Of course, this event was to be in person, but we're doing the best we can in these times to do what we can to join each other virtually. So if we have a tech glitch, just forgive us. We'll fix it as quickly as we can, and we'll keep it moving. And we're going to hear from our guests for a little bit first, and then you will have an opportunity to submit questions in the chat box. So as they occur to you, feel free to put them in chat, and we will queue them up after we hear a little bit of an opening from each one of our guests. I wanted to start with an Audre Lorde quote that, she's got 12 or 15 that I love, but for today's conversation, I'm sure many of us are familiar with her quote: "Caring for myself is not a self-indulgence, it's a self-preservation," and that is an act of political warfare. So I just want us to keep in mind that this is a really important part of the work. It is not something that we do as sort of on the weekend or extra or when we can find the time, that it is really central to our ability to do it. So first, I really would like to begin with just a little bit of an introduction of our first guest, Brittany Packnett-Cunningham, who is an activist, an educator, writer, leader at the intersection of culture and justice. She is a co-founder of Campaign Zero. She's an NBC News contributor and co-host of Pod Save the People, iHeartRadio's best political podcast of last year. She's a former elementary school teacher, an education executive, a Harvard fellow. She has done it all, but her job, her work that we are most familiar with most often is her work to end police violence. So welcome, Brittany. I'd like to start with a question about your work at Campaign Zero, which is, as I said, to end police violence, it's a persistent threat, but it also has such profound moments of stress and pain. And I want to have you talk with us a little bit about how you do the work to sustain through sort of the day-to-day work of Campaign Zero, but also to recover in those moments where it is just a lot. It is just deeply personal and painful. And how do you sort of recover as well in those moments to keep going?
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for having me. This is such a critically important conversation. Hello to everyone who is watching. Thanks for tuning in. A couple of things just about the world in which I work when it comes to issues of police violence. First, we call it police violence and not police brutality because brutality conveys an episodic experience, whereas violence correctly conveys what is happening at a systemic level, that the kinds of systems that have been built of policing in this country have made it such that people are experiencing police violence in all kinds of ways. We kind of see the most dramatic and unfortunate and tragic events in our faces all the time when we think about what happened to Breonna Taylor in Kentucky as a recent example. But there are various levels of police violence, everything there's a wide range rather, and we want to make sure that we are communicating a systemic problem and not just an episodic one. But we built Campaign Zero in 2015 in the midst of the ongoing Ferguson uprising, of which I am a proud member, because we heard people consistently asking us what the pressure was for. So we had been mounting all of this pressure onto the streets. To what end was always the ultimate and necessary question. And there had been a lot of local work to make sure that policing regulations, state laws, municipal regulations, et cetera, were being shifted and changed and paid attention to so that we could stop experiencing nearly the amount of police violence that we were on the streets of St. Louis. But we wanted to expand that to a national conversation. And I am a believer that nothing about us should be done without us. So we can write that policy. We can do that research. We can tap the resources and had access to the spaces that gave us the information to design the world that we wanted to live in. I also sat on the Ferguson Commission and President Obama's policing task force. And so with information from those spaces, information from scholars and academics, and most importantly, information from grassroots leaders and ideas from grassroots leaders and activists and organizers and community members from around the entire country, Campaign Zero was formed. Campaign Zero is not an organization or a group where you have to pay dues to become a member. It is a platform of policies divided into 10 bucket areas that we believe will begin to transform the experience of policing and how everyday citizens experience that system right here in America. We call it Campaign Zero because we believe we can live in a world where the police don't kill people. Not campaign half, not campaign 50%, not campaign fewer, Campaign Zero. And that actually brings me to my first point about your question about sustaining and recovering in the midst of this work. It is about a set of mindsets that we have to operate, and then a set of actions that those mindsets lead us to take. The first mindset is that we have to be motivated not by fear, but by hope, not by oppression, but by imagination, not by hate, but by love. So this idea that we can live in a world where the police don't kill people is as imaginative as you can get in that particular space. And there's so many people who look at us and they hear that tagline and they say, well, no, the police are always going to kill somebody. And we will ask them, what would it take to dare to imagine a world where the police actually do not kill people? How do we get there? How do we intentionally put one foot in front of the other and engage in the kind of pressure mounting that the streets provide and the kind of imaginative policy making that can be done in boardrooms and in congressional halls and state houses across the country? How can we combine the power of those two things to ensure that we actually can get to that place of our wildest imagination and not simply live in the place of what is expected, right? The predictable future. When we are fueled by what we hate, by what is oppressing us, it can be incredibly difficult to sustain the work. So you have to first examine the roots of what you're doing and why you're doing it. You need something to be excited about and hopeful for. That is life-giving and life-affirming, both for the individual and for the movement at hand. And so the roots of what you are doing are just as important as the fruits in terms of how we actually sustain the work and make sure that it's something that can allow us to keep going. The next mindset is really about building teams and not saviors. We know we have watched so many movements where they think that if you take out the leader, that the whole trying to make sure that we're not deifying a particular individual, but that we really think about how we are giving lots of people the knowledge and the skills that they need to be effective in multiple areas, so that if for some reason you are weak today or you need to step back, then somebody else can step up, and that there are people there to share the load. The last really important mindset is actually the quote that you used, which is one of my very favorites from Audre Lorde, about this idea of self-care as political warfare. One of the founders of SNCC put it to me another way. He said that the will of the enemy or the oppressor is not simply, or the goal rather, is not simply to kill you, it is to kill your will to resist, right? And so if we are not well enough to continue the resistance, then what is it all for, right? So there we have a responsibility to the work we say we care about to be well enough to actually do it and do it well. So those are the mindsets. And quickly, the actions that we take, therefore, are one, caring just as much about our spiritual health and emotional IQ as we do about the policies and procedures and regulations at hand. It is really important that we are honest about how we are doing while we're in the midst of this work. The status quo doesn't want to let people of color, women of color, be full human beings who are allowed to cry and be angry and have rage and all of those things and still be intelligent and strategic, etc. But we contain multitudes. We all do. And so do women of color. So do Black women. And so we start a lot of our organizing meetings just asking people how they're doing, what headspace are you in, talking about those things publicly to give other people permission to do the same. Because again, being full human beings as women of color allows us to help fight the status quo in even more subtle ways. Secondly, we create tools and boundaries. We hear people talk about boundaries a lot these days, and they are critically important. But tools aid in the work, boundaries protect the people doing the work. And it's an important distinction. So the kind of tools and systems that you build in your organizing space are critically important because you have to examine them to make sure that they're actually helping people be more effective and helping people work smarter and not harder, right? The boundaries are the things that you put up to say, look, this is what I need to be able to restore, not just to the ends of being able to do the work, but also for that. And clearly communicating both what the tools are and who can help you exercise those tools and what the boundaries are and who can help you uphold those boundaries are critically important. It's not just about communicating that to the other people that you work with in your organizing space. It's also about communicating that to your loved ones so that they can help you keep track of those things. The very last action that I think is important in this thought about sustaining and recovering to keep the work going is about only carrying your baggage. We often take on too much, right? And so we will say, well, I'm the only one who can do this part right, or who can build the website, or who can do the interview, or who can do whatever. We build teams, not saviors, right? So don't deify yourself and assume that you are the only person who can do something effectively. True leaders build other leaders. And so making sure that other people, when we pick up other people's baggage for them, we often absolve them of their own responsibility. If you are a parent and you you put washing dishes on the chore list for your child, and then you keep washing the dishes, your child is going to learn that they don't actually ever have to wash the dishes, right? So they're never actually going to develop the skill. They're never going to develop the expectation of themselves. And they're going to always learn that someone else will pick up whatever they drop. It's important for us, especially as we interact with people who are allies or co-conspirators in this space. So white people, wealthy people, men, etc., depending on what you're working on, it is important that we don't absolve them of their responsibility. I'll tell you a quick story. Last week, we were doing some organizing around Breonna Taylor, who was killed by police in Kentucky almost 2 months ago. And she just came into national prominence over the last week because we had been working so hard on this, and finally got in touch with some local organizers who had been working for the last 2 months. And so, I did the thing that I'm telling you not to do. I went and stayed up all night and built the website and made the calls and did the thing on the podcast and got the word out and was tweeting all the time and was making phone calls and talking to folks and doing all the interviews. And then my friend, Sarah Sophie Flicker, who is one of the folks from the planning team of the Women's March, a white woman, she reached out and she said, what do you need me to do? Because you actually shouldn't be doing all of this. And I said, ding, 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 you're absolutely right. Here's somebody who wants to stand in solidarity. So let you actually do that. One of the things I had said on the podcast was actually a quote from a woman named Jonna Riley, who's an educator. She said to white people, what are you doing to raise children to make sure that your children won't kill mine? And I said, Sarah, a lot of people have been asking me for parenting advice, books, resources. I'm not a parent. I don't have any of those. She said, we're already on it. We're already building it. So make sure that you only carry your responsibility, your work, and your baggage, and make sure that other people do the work that is theirs.
Okay, I love all of it. That is a masterclass. I love mindsets, boundaries, teams, not carrying baggage. Like, we're going to circle back to every single one of those things. Thank you so much. And I have all my notes, so we're not going to miss a thing. Thank you so much. I would like to now introduce Gracia Martinez Rosas, who is the Deputy Executive Director of United We Dream, the largest immigrant youth-led network in the country with more than 400,000 members. Gracia is a United We Dream strategist and implements the organization's vision as they build power throughout the country. She migrated from Mexico to the US with her parents when she was young and grew up in Dallas, Texas. In 2006, she began organizing Latinos to vote, and she's been a fearless defender of those rights and the undocumented community and just women in general ever since. So welcome, Gracia. I want to pose a question to you that is really about sort of building yourself for what you know is going to be a long haul, a long fight. And sort of all of our fights are long. But we can't talk about this conversation of resilience and sort of sustaining ourselves without some of the political setbacks that our movements suffer. And certainly 2016 election was one of them. And in that situation, even before the election, the campaign rhetoric was traumatic all on its own. It was clear immediately that our policy fights, our rhetorical fights, just everything was just going to be, we were going to be in a different world than we had experienced for the last 8 years. And this was going to be particularly true for people who are undocumented. Ask you about how you and United We Dream prepared for, what we knew would be at least, the next 4 years of that different world, and how you factored sustaining yourselves into planning for that new landscape.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. Hello to everyone watching at home. I hope you're safe, that your loved ones are safe, and that we remain healthy. I really appreciate the space of being able to talk about resilience and how that looks like, in particular, for me within immigrant young queer communities. When I thought about that question as you raised it, I went back to the day when we first heard Trump sort of announce his candidacy for president, and all of us were like saying, like, making jokes about his show and The Apprentice and like moving on, and really preparing for like the eventual election of Hillary Clinton and preparing the campaign to have her let our people go from detention. And I remember the sinking feeling in my gut when the results came in November, and I was in a room surrounded by undocumented immigrant mothers that were ready to demand to clear things from Hillary Clinton that same day. And as an organizer, feeling like, oh, I don't know what to do right now. Like, what are we supposed to do? Like, we have a whole room full of people. What are we supposed to say? But, actually, I had to be able to like allow the spirit, my organizing training, and also like my soul be able to carry us into this moment. And so I knew that like instinctively that we needed to bring people together. And so that same night we saw mothers take this big banner that we had throughout the election that said Donald Trump is a racist, and they took it to the front of the White House, and they really set the tone for the movement about what the audacity that it would take, the courage, the focused anger at something larger. That it was more than Donald Trump. It was sort of death and despair within our folks. And, you know, that really for us, you know, just a couple of years before, in June of 2016, that, like about 500 immigrant young people gathered together in Houston, Texas for our United We Dream Congress. And on that last night of our convening, we had the news of the Pulse nightclub shooting. And immediately, politicians, news reporters, even the public fed into this idea that pitted queer folks against Muslim folks, against Black folks, against brown people. And in that moment, there was a moment of choice for us. And it was very clear that we said, hell no. Like, we are the embodiment of all of these different identities, and we are together, and we will determine together our futures. And it is evident that in the face of this moment, it's not just about policy, it is a cultural fight to define who belongs here, who is allowed to be emotional in public, who is allowed to make clear demands, who's allowed to dream. And I think that for us, the fact that we were together, happened to take place in Florida, double the amount of undocumented young people during a Donald Trump administration gathered in Miami. And we said very clearly that our destinations and our views are linked into more than just immigrant rights policy and like all of those pieces, but that our realities are really linked together. Our futures are linked together. And so I remember seeing nearly like 1,200 people knocking on doors for the Second Chance Amendment that would allow people with felony charges to be able to take back their ability to engage in our democracy. And that for me draws like some lessons that I, in this moment of COVID, when we are seeing in particular Black people face the brunt of what it means for politicians to make strategic choices to ensure that our people are denied health care, denied the ability to survive, and denied the ability to live. I am reminded of the three things. One is that you have to be with people, that the people most closest to the pain are closest to the solution. It's not because of the stories. It's not because we want to expose the trauma that people are feeling, but because those people are at the core of the most strategic options moving forward. The second one is that we must ensure that we are holding on to hope. I'm the daughter of a Southern Baptist preacher, and in this moment, I'm reminded, and I've shared this in other spaces, of the story of slaves leaving Egypt, and they had just gone through all of these trials and tribulations. They'd been there for centuries, it felt like, and they were finally out, and they were in the edge of the water right before the waters parted. And I could imagine them knowing that there was no way that they could go back to that reality. There was no way that they would go back to being slaves, but yet not feeling like what the pathway forward was. And right before the waters parted is the moment where we're in right now. There is no way that the past or the past normal will work for any of us, because it was killing us before Trump, during Trump, and unless there are clear political interventions that people of color, that those directly affected are able to make, we cannot go back to that. And so that's the second one, is like the people most directly impacted. And then the third one for me is being able to hold on to the joy. Being able to hold on to the hope of the moment. And in that story, and in my own story, I remember crossing the Rio Grande waters with my mom and my dad, not knowing what was going to happen to us at the other side, whether we were going to make it or not. And the warmth that I felt from my mom and my dad's hand as we together held hands together as we made it through that river is the same hope that I'm holding on to right now when we're going through very difficult moments. And it is the call that I get from my friends, the text that I send to people telling them that I love them. Those are the things that will ensure that we are keeping hope alive within each and every one of us, and that we are reminding ourselves that we are accountable to one another. So I'm honored to be in this space with all of you. I'm honored to and ready to continue to figure out how we're going to move forward and fight. And I am also asking myself to keep hope alive and remember that faith exists in organizing, and organizing is love in action.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I absolutely love just the reminder that joy has to be at the center of the work. We can't do work if we don't feel good about it. And I think this goes back to some of what Brittany was saying also about just reframing the work. It's not all about the threats. It's about being imaginative and the possibilities and the people that we do it with. So thank you. Thank you for that. I'd like to turn now to our third guest, Deepa Iyer, who we're just so honored to have, and she's going to help us sort of contextualize and think more about all of the things that we've heard, because this is her everyday work. Deepa is a South Asian American writer, lawyer, strategist, and facilitator, and an activist in her own right. She's currently the senior advisor at the Building Movement Project and the director at Solidarity Is, a project that trains people and works with narrative and resources on building deep and lasting multiracial solidarity. Her expertise and interests include the post 9/11 America experience, particularly for South Asian, Muslim, Arab, and Sikh immigrants. She has a book called We Too Sing America, South Asian, Arab, Muslim, and Sikh Immigrants Shape Our Multiracial Future, which received the 2016 American Book Award. Deepa, we are so honored to have you here. And I'd like to start with a question about the work that you do every day. You train advocates and activists in solidarity and how they can sustain themselves and their movements. And so I'd like to hear from you what solidarity is, how you describe it, and the relationship that you think it has to resilience.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Erica. Appreciate you and the Raven Group team for putting this conversation together, and welcome to everyone who's watching. I've been really sitting with the powerful insights that Grace and Brittany have shared. And I come to this, and I just wanted to give a little bit of background as someone who has found myself in leadership roles in times of crisis. And one of those moments, as you alluded to, Erica, was the post 9/11 moment. And it was a time where folks will remember we were looking at acts of vandalism at mosques and gurdwaras. We were looking at hate violence incidents and bullying of Sikh and Muslim children. People were surveilled and monitored if they came from certain South Asian or Arab countries. And it wasn't happening out there. It was happening to us. It was happening to our uncles and aunties and to the places of worship that we had grown up in. And so it was deeply personal as the time. And not surprisingly, most of those people were women of color. And what I learned over the 20 years of working on post 9/11 America issues is that solidarity is a critical strategy to build interconnectedness. It's a strategy to build this idea of I see you, and we may not be completely the same in terms of our histories of oppression, but we are connected through a common thread. And so that's really why solidarity is a strategy to build that type of resilience. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how I think it's really important to address this question of how do we not just survive in the work that we do around social change, but how do we also thrive, right? And I think that in order to answer that question, we have to come at it on three different levels: the individual, the organizational, and the larger movement level. So I'm going to see if I can break those down and offer some resources for each. So at the individual level, and we've heard this from Brittany and Grace as well, activists are often dealing with a range of impacts and consequences of being first responders and visionaries, especially in moments of crisis in our communities. And it can manifest in many ways, from physical illness to mental health concerns to sheer numbness to feelings of shame, even when we share that we feel the weight of our work. And particularly with women of color, we're really expected to present this picture of strength and resiliency, because if we show vulnerability, we're perceived as unable to properly lead. At the organizational level, there is often the push to maintain a really high impact and nonstop environment. We reward productivity and performance, but not as much reflection and visioning, relationship building, or course correction. Our organizations are often going from one crisis to the next, and those that are led by women of color in particular are expected to do more with fewer resources, because we have to prove ourselves against white dominant standards of leadership that don't really match the way that we naturally lead. And then if you zoom out to the movement level, activists are expected to be charismatic personalities on social media, to always have the wokest analysis, to be inspiring and inclusive at all times. There is call-out culture, which is often disguised as accountability. Celebrity activists are held up as a standard to which the rest of us have to aspire. And in this situation, building solidarity and interconnectedness can sometimes be challenging, because we're operating in a culture of scarcity, crisis, and competition, rather than abundance and interconnectedness. So how do we interrupt the cycle? So on each of these levels, we can make interventions. So at the individual level, I want to offer a tool that I developed. And Elizabeth, if you could put up this graphic, I would really appreciate it. I put together this graphic and this guide called Mapping Our Roles in a Social Change Ecosystem at a time, about a year or so after the election, as Grace was talking about, when I felt extremely lost and confused and on the seesaw of being either outraged or numb. And I kept asking myself, what is my role? I've been doing this for over 15 years, and why am I having such a hard time figuring that out? So I put together this tool where I've identified a lot of different roles that we play, and these aren't job titles, they're roles. So roles such as visionaries, or builders, or disruptors, or storytellers. And when you look at this, this guide, which offers definitions of these roles, but also a set of reflection questions, it can help us understand how to map our roles in any given ecosystem, how to reflect on which ones are draining from us, which ones we aspire to, and to also understand what our broader ecosystem looks like. Who else is playing roles and where? Are we well balanced in our movement, our coalition, or do we need to make some tweaks? So beyond clarifying what roles connect to our purpose, there are other ways we can thrive at the individual level. Brittany talked about the importance of boundary setting. We can recognize that we don't have to play all these roles all the time. We can pass the mic to others. We can really breathe into our FOMO and let it go. We can mentor others, and of course, make time for activities that give us energy and rest. That's a lot of the self-care, right? But I think that we also need to be thinking about collective care, which takes me to the organizational level. You can pull the graphic down, Elizabeth. Thank you. So on the organizational and movement level, we also should be thinking about how to build resiliency and joy. And with organizations, for example, how can your organization's work be more trauma-informed, particularly when it relates to organizers? How can you ensure that your staff have access to mental care or alternative health, or that staff are even working less hours? What resources can be made available in terms of sabbaticals or supports for caregivers? What programs can we just say no to? And for funders, how can funders scale up organizations and even create incubators for executive directors to transition out so that we don't see a cycle of people going from one ED job to the next? And how do we build a bench? This time, I think this moment is a good one to change our policies and practices, because now that remote work is all of a sudden doable in many instances, what more can we do? And lastly, the movement level. I think we can hold each other with a whole lot more grace and understanding. We can more readily forgive each other. We can make room for many others, especially younger women of color in our spaces. We can infuse our movement spaces with this sense of abundance. And that's where solidarity comes in. It's a strategy, as I said earlier, for building well-being. It's a way of saying, I see you, and even though we're not the same, we have so much in common. It's this sense of building relationships, building trust, and otherwise our connections are so transactional in nature. And so transformative solidarity requires deeper connectivity, community building, and interconnectedness, and it can actually provide the safety net we need, not only to survive, but also to thrive. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepa. So I'm just going to let everybody backstage for a minute. We were having church in the private chat over all the things that Deepa was saying. So there's just a lot. There's a lot there, and I'm just excited to bring us all together so that we can have a little bit more of a conversation about some of the strategies that you're helping us unpack. So we're going to bring everybody in the room together. I really want to start with something that you said about just this balance of like having to be perfect, having to represent yourself outwardly. You can't, you have a public face. I mean, all of you do, right? You write, you're commentators, you are called upon to do events like this and to speak to stadiums full of people. So you have a public persona, and there's a huge, I don't want to call it a burden, but there's a lot to carry with that. And I just want to just hear from you all, and I can just start with you, Brittany, about sort of what the balance is between just sort of helping people with the idea that like learning is a part of this work. It's how you continue to grow and thrive in the work. We're not perfect. We're always learning. The world changes. And then that tension with having to be the leader and having to know all the things and be the wokest and, just whatever feels like it's on the other side of that.
Yes, I was the one in the chat who was like, "Oh, Deepa's out here preaching," especially this perception that I'm not only supposed to have a very clear woke analysis, if you will, but that it is supposed to be instantaneous, that it is supposed to be 100% accurate and disagreeable with by no one, and that it is supposed to be fully informed by like both scholarship and personal experience, right? Which is an impossible standard for literally anyone to uphold all the time, let alone even some of the time. So that pressure is great. And I think for me, my own therapeutic practice has been really helpful in helping me let go of that, because just because there are other people's expectations of me don't mean I have to accept them as the expectations that I have of myself. And so deciding when to say something, if to say something, it is part of how I have wrestled my power back from that space. But listen, I mean, some of that is my job, especially now that I'm on MSNBC. I get paid to do that, right? And so certainly when Ahmaud Arbery was killed, when we found out about Breonna Taylor's murder, the email started flooding in from the producers and the booker saying, "Can we have you on?" Not only because of my identity, but because of the work that I do. And so a lot of it, and from a very personal space, is about my spiritual practice, trying to get as aligned as I possibly can, not just with my thoughts, but with my physical body, identifying where the stress is there so that I can do the things that I need to do to alleviate that stress, so that it doesn't just become a powder keg of emotions waiting to explode. But to Deepa's point, it also is about collective care. So when I was running a large nonprofit, I remember the day that Alton Sterling was killed by police in Baton Rouge and Philando Castile was killed by police in Minneapolis, a day apart from each other. And I just emailed my team and I said, look, if you need to take the day, take the day. And that was the first time I really started to think through how we create the environments for teams of people to be able to say, this is actually what I need from my peers and my colleagues right now in order to be my best self. And sometimes what I need is space. And so identifying those things, being honest about those things, again, tools and boundaries, being really, really clear about those things, I think is important, even as kind of public faces of this. But what I also think is critically important is that in the moments that we are learning, that we share those with other people. I like to say that I'm learning in public, right? Which can feel like a burden sometimes, but I try to reframe that in my self-talk and really think about it as a great privilege and hopefully as a lesson for someone else. So one of the areas where I have grown, I think, pretty tremendously because other people have helped me get there is around disability rights. My father was disabled for part of his life physically. I have disabilities myself in terms of my mental health. And there were times I wasn't using the right words. I wasn't looking at things the right way. I was engaging in kind of trauma porn or disability porn that actually was not empowering people and recognizing the agency of people with disabilities. And so there are a lot of people who have helped bring me along. And as I learn, I both own what I didn't know publicly, and I also try to share what I've now learned publicly, right? And so I try to make sure that I am putting out into the world the kind of calling in instead of calling out that I want to experience as well, so that I can contribute to a culture where people are not ashamed to say, look, 10 years ago, I didn't know this and now I know better, but are actually excited to share that, because then they can illuminate the path for somebody else. Are intentional about it. We should all constantly be on the road of not only knowing better, but doing better.
That's great. Gracia, do you want to piggyback at all?
Yeah. I'm so honored to be on this panel with all of you. I'm just like taking it all in. Yeah, I've actually had this same conversation with my spiritual guides and my therapist. And I think that my ability to be able to like say really clearly that like that I'm really lucky to be able to have a support system around me, and ensuring that that's something that is not particularly in Latino families and immigrant families, having that conversation is really difficult. I will say to the earlier question, you know, United We Dream sort of started from this idea that we would want to talk about the issues of undocumented young people, and someone projected their own ideas about the perfect immigrant, the dreamer with the cap and the gown, and the one that like could do no wrong, that was obviously deservedly of citizenship. And in that time, there was a lot of conversations between our immigrant rights community about like immigrants not being criminals, so that's why we deserve to have protections. And there's just been such an evolution of the work, knowing that that is not only like not thoughtful and not in solidarity with Black folks in this country, but it is also not. It is something that we are continuing to do self-harm to ourselves as we continue to have these narratives. And so, as a woman that most of the time I'm the youngest, the only undocumented woman in the spaces that I occupy, I of course have the pressures of being the perfect messenger for all 11 million undocumented people and having the most wokest analysis of what that means, and standing in solidarity as a queer woman that is like light skinned. All of those things sort of come into play. But one of the things that I've really sort of embedded into my own thinking is that I am enough, that my organization is enough and more than that, and that the people that surround us, like people like Deepa and Brittany and the people that are around us, are the ones that are going to hold us in the tough times, call us in when we need to be called in, and ensure that we're successful. And so for us, it's ensuring that we're surrounded by those people and not allowing for those voices of what is enough or defining someone else defining that to come into play. So you know, we have the DACA decision, as I mentioned, that is coming up, and a lot of people are thinking about what's going to happen to the DACAs, to the kids. We really want to have a conversation about the millions of people and thousands of people that are incarcerated in this country right now, and that are it's more than just the kids that are coming, but it's really ensuring that we're using those moments of a cultural shift to bring along everybody with us. So that's what I think about when I think about your question.
Yeah. It's just occurring to me that like vulnerability, which is something that you were talking about, Deepa, is like something that you're both expressing, you're both showing us vulnerability right now. You're talking about learning curves that you had, being honest with yourself and grappling in public about limitations, whether they are physical or mental health limitations, all of those things. So just sort of, there's something about that is even just self-care all on its own, to just be able to say it and just let it be true. And then also that it does build solidarity because it allows other people who do work to hear you. So Deepa, can you talk a little bit more about vulnerability? And
Yeah,
we could talk all day about it, but I'd love to hear more from you about that.
yeah. I've been thinking a little bit about how, in many ways, I really do feel that the system of white supremacy wants us to be moving from one crisis to another over and over. And so, in many ways, taking the space and time to actually acknowledge the impact of that on our lives and on our mental health, just as Brittany and Grace just did, and on our movements is really valuable and important. So this ability to create the space, so like you all have created, but the spaces that we create, where we're able to convene together, where we're able to actually sit with each other and learn from each other and not have to work out a campaign all the time necessarily, right? We have to do that, but we also need the spaces to reflect, to be able to learn from each other, to share strategies, to tell our stories. I love, it's really important to me to hear Grace's story. I have been honored to hear her story many times in space and together and in larger groups of people. And it is very powerful. And it reminds me also of aspects of my immigrant story too. And so making space to share stories and relate to each other, slow down, be vulnerable, say the mistakes that we've made and learned from. And the last thing I'll say is also spaces to vision. Because we are reacting so much in that crisis cycle, we just don't have enough spaces to actually envision the types of futures, the equitable, inclusive futures that we all want to be part of, to figure out what does liberation mean? What does shared liberation mean? What does linked fates mean, as Grace has said earlier? And so in this moment, I've been thinking a lot about this call to action from Arundhati Roy, who's an Indian writer, where she talks about how the pandemic is a portal. And so if we could take the space to think about the portal to what, right? And what are we carrying through that portal? And so the ability to envision and dream is such an important part of also cultivating the joy. So those are some ways I think that creating the space to learn from each other, to slow down, share stories, and to be able to dream and build towards the future are so important.
Thank you. Thank you. So I want us to go now to some audience questions. So this question is from Molly. You're 100% right. We need to keep training allies and steering them toward the right tools to pull their weight in DE&I work. Do you have any specific tools or resources that you'd recommend, Deepa?
Sure, if you want to start. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I think diversity, equity, and inclusion has become sort of like the buzzword, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that first and foremost, we need to recognize that diversity is just a starting point, right? And that we need to be able to define what equity and inclusion actually means. And if it isn't about having a liberatory framework, if it isn't about addressing anti-Black racism, if it isn't about centering the people who are most affected, then it's just words. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the ability to define, so the first, tools or resources is how does an organization or how do allies actually define equity and inclusion, and do those elements that I just mentioned figure into that? And if not, how can they? One of the things I always say to organizations is that if we have a commitment to equity and inclusion, then we should actually be engaged in addressing anti-Black racism. So if that's not part and parcel of the work that we do, and it's not articulated, then we're not really addressing equity and inclusion. So I think the framework is key. And then the second piece is that trainings are just a starting point, and they have to be about anti-racism trainings. They're not just about diversity trainings, right? Like, we recognize implicit bias now, but we need to get beyond that to systemic racism and what that looks like and how to deal with that in our organizations and outside. And then, so framework, trainings that are on anti-racism beyond implicit bias. And then the third thing is the follow-up. How is it modeled by leadership? What are the policies and practices look like? Does your leadership actually reflect the diversity of your organization or your community. So those are some of the three pieces that I would say in terms of tools and resources.
Great. So in addition to all of the really great advice that Deepa just gave, just a couple of other actionable items. One, again, on this mindset piece is to think about how you are graduating from being an ally to an accomplice and an accomplice to a co-conspirator. So when we talk about allies, we talk about people who care, but who show up when it is convenient for them. When we talk about accomplices, we talk about people who care and are willing to take some risk. And when we talk about co-conspirators, we talk about people who are willing to take so much risk that they're willing to be there from beginning to end and help plan the whole thing with you. So think about how you are taking steps toward moving through those phases. And knowing full well, and I use the word graduate, but it is not quite so simple, because it is an iterative experience, right? You will ebb and flow through those spaces depending on the community that you are learning to be a co-conspirator to, depending on the ways in which your life is changing, in which you are growing and what you're learning, et cetera. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that technology makes us able, technology and books make it possible for all of us to listen without interruption. And so often we will see people ask folks to say, well, what should I read? What should I go watch? Who should I talk to? Who should I follow? But there's so many things that are already interruption, and for you to be able to learn without actually requesting that labor, right? So like, the running joke is Google is free, but it genuinely is free. And there's so many times when you're asking somebody who's just going to go Google the answer, or who Googled the answer 10 years ago, and that's why they have it for you now. And so before you make the request, do the research to figure out if you actually can go find the answer yourself, or if you really are stuck. The other thing is to remember consistently to ask permission, right? As you are learning, when you begin to step into a space and say, look, I want to be an accomplice and a co-conspirator to this community, ask like, am I allowed here? Do you need me? Do you actually want what I have to offer? Because one of the ways that we so often, those of us who have privilege in any of the spaces we walk in, continue to perpetuate that privilege, is assuming that other people want our solidarity. Sometimes there are times when communities are saying, we are doing this for us and by us, and that is what the work calls for right now. So thank you very much for the offer, but we're going to decline right now. And you have to be okay with that, right? So if you're not okay with that, that's another opportunity for you to grow and learn. When you do find yourself learning, when you find yourself reading the books, listening to the podcasts, following the hashtags, following the thinkers and leaders online, offer some kind of pay for that, right? So some people make their Cash App tags available. Some people, have paywalls in front of their podcast. So that's how you can contribute. But for example, when I was trying to learn much more about disability rights, I found a conference here locally where a lot of the speakers that I had been following were speaking, and I paid people were like, well, we can get you a registration to the conference. I said, no, I will pay my way to the conference, because I'm not going to come here and steal this labor. And then as I sat in people's sessions, I would make donations to the organizations that they led, right? That there are ways for you to make sure that you are offering something in return for the labor that you are receiving. Hashtags are a really, really easy way to start to learn about the things that you do not know about. So Crip the Vote for the disabled community is something, it's helped me learn a lot about some of the clear distinctions that need to be made in disability policy, especially right now as we are working our way through the coronavirus. Hashtags like Native Twitter or Indigenous Twitter, I'm learning a ton from those as well. Again, I can listen without interruption and without requesting someone's labor, because these conversations are already happening. I'm just doing the work of making sure that I'm paying attention and changing my behavior the more that I learn. The last thing I will say is that if you are specifically interested in your racial identity development, the first book I tell everyone to start with is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? By Beverly Daniel Tatum. She's the former president of Spelman College in Atlanta, which is a HBCU, all women's college, incredibly stellar place, but she's also an education researcher by trade. And she talks about the process of racial identity development for all people of color and white people. And it's incredibly helpful in demystifying how we experience the world based on our racial identity, how people experience us based on our racial identity, and how we can actually set some real goals for ourselves in terms of how we grow, learn, and perform differently.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We are going to go to another audience question, and I think this may be our last one, and it's for you, Graca. Just for the benefit of the audience, I'll read. I've heard you say that to make change, you have to feel injustice in your bones, but this is depleting. How do you make the most effective change when the inspiration is self-destructive?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's been one of the biggest lesson points that we have had to take in as we've built United We Dream, that a lot of the initial impetus for why we started to fight was that we saw like our family members deported. My dad was deported about 10 years ago, and that's the thing that like my willingness or my pain of having my dad stolen from me by this government was the thing that made me want to organize. And over the years, I recognize the depleting element or effect of that. And what I have found myself is that though it is a starting point, it does not have to be the place that you stay. And while we do, I believe that organizing, as I shared with you, is like a faith in action and love in action. And that means like building community, as Brittany was talking about, building teams and the leadership development of the people behind you and around you, and ensuring that like I have been able to like push myself to know that like I am not responsible for my dad's deportation, that I am not alone, and that there are people that are going through the same pain that I went through that I can now be in community to and accountable to, and hold space for while we're doing there. And so when my comment was about like the people that feel that pain are closest to the solutions because they know what it's like to walk in those shoes. And sometimes in particular in some of our movements, there are folks that come in with their analyses and like their big ideas, but they don't know what it's like to like really walk into those shoes, and the strategy is sometimes counterintuitive or counter to the overall goal. For us, we want to dismantle ICE and CBP because we know that those are the folks that are causing pain to our community, and that ask has to be linked to something broader than just for immigrants. And so, I'll say that like organizing, I think, has been the antidote for me, building teams and like really leaning into what we call undocujoy, is just being able to sing and like joke and make fun of each other and just be in community. That's been the piece that's inspired me to move from a self-destructive place and a place of pain to a place of joy and a sense of larger purpose.
Yeah, thank you so much, Graca. Brittany, I'd like to go to you next and just have you speak about this also.
Sure. I mean, first of all, I am just so grateful for this conversation, Erica, for the really gentle and thoughtful way you are guiding it. Graca and Deepa, you all are brilliant, bad, you can fill in the blank. But we all sit on panels a lot, right? And there are plenty of times when we do this, and it's not every time when you get to also learn so much and be inspired while you are sitting next to such brilliant people. So I'm really grateful for the way this is filling me up, because you all are both so brilliant. And I love this. Joy is resistance too, right? And this is why I talk so much about a white supremacist status quo that does not want to let anyone who sits outside of it, no matter what your identities are, anyone who sits outside of that archetype is not allowed to be a full human being. So we are not allowed to be sad when it's fair to be sad. We are not allowed to be angry when it's fair to be angry. We are not allowed to be happy because this system is supposed to oppress and depress the happiness right out of us, the joy right out of us, right? And so there are so many times when the community that we have built in protest and in struggle, and it really is a community, that our moments of celebration are just as important, if not more, than our moments of protest. The graduations that we've attended, the birthday parties, the holiday dinners that get put together of a hodgepodge of people that you would never have known had you not been tear gassed together, frankly. One of my godchildren is the child of somebody that I met in the street, right? And so, these are the kinds of things that keep us bound to one another, beyond just the things that make us angry, right? And that is truly what stitches movements together. Us being willing to imagine what is possible, and us loving ourselves so much that love can overtake the hate that we receive. The drumming and the singing and the dancing and the art and the fashion and the hairstyles and all of the ways that we express our self-love are all opportunities for us to engage in the practice of joy, to engage in the resistance of joy. And these are not nice to haves. These are must haves, right? These are things that help fuel movements truly. I know I said it at the very beginning, but this is what I constantly come back to. I am not interested, and I did not join this work. I did not grow up as an activist, as an organizer, and continue to be one because of the things that I hate, right? I am doing this work, and I do this work because I love myself, because I love my family, because I love my community, because I love my people, because I love all of the people who've been kissed a little extra by the sun, who continue to be pushed out to the margins instead of being loved at the center. And I do this because the dream of what's possible and what I can imagine when I take off all of the shackles that oppression tries to put on me, give me the fuel to keep going. And that is where I try to center myself when I'm finding myself in an angry space or a frustrated space or a tired space, which are all justified. If I can bring myself back to that space of being fueled by hope instead of fear, then I
just really short. I think, one, find your role and how it's connected to your purpose. And two, find your squad, because that's where the collective care, that's where the storytelling, that's where the sustenance can really take place. And third, if you're part of an organization or you're in leadership roles supporting organizations and movements, what can you do to create a culture of survival, but also thriving and joy? There are lots of tools out there. Adrienne Marie Brown, there are organizations that are providing tools and resources. If folks are interested in the work that I put out earlier, you can also just really encourage folks to reach out and find the resources and tools you need to figure out how you connect to your purpose and your roles.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. This has been self-care. I am so glad that we did this with all of you. This was the perfect group, the perfect conversation to have, especially at this time. And I know we all took so much away from it. And we thank you for your work and your time and your commitments, and just your love for everything you do. So to our audience,
thanks for creating the space.
Truly.
Thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. We've kept you over a little bit, but as I said, we could go all day. So thank you. And just stay tuned. We are going to be sending out other notices of other really important conversations with leaders just like Deepa, Brittany, and Gracia. And it's our pleasure to do it. So thank you.
Take care.
Be well,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.